Have you heard the term Karen? I mean, maybe you've even used it yourself, or perhaps you felt it sting, or witnessed it being wielded in public.
Oh, yeah.
It feels like this immediate cultural shorthand just exploded into our lexicon almost overnight, didn't it? Becoming this instant, recognizable descriptor.
It truly did. It's really transformed into a cultural phenomenon, hasn't it? An archetype that instantly conjures up a very specific set of behaviors and, well, attitudes. What's truly fascinating here, I think, is how quickly it became so deeply embedded in our collective understanding, especially considering its widespread adoption is actually pretty recent.
It's remarkable, isn't it?
Yeah.
And that's exactly what we're dedicating this deep dive to today. We're going to unpack the Karen stereotype. We'll explore its complex and, often troubling origins, delve into its core meaning, and really try to grapple with the intense debate surrounding its racial and gendered implications.
Right.
We'll examine why it became so pervasive and how it reflects much larger societal conversations. Things like power, privilege, and perceived entitlement.
And our mission today really is to cut through all the noise that inevitably surrounds a term like this one.
Yeah.
We've pulled insights from a truly diverse range of sources. I mean, everything from heated Reddit discussions and, pop culture references, all the way to academic reports on intersectionality and some pretty rigorous historical analyses.
That's right. Our goal is to extract the most important nuggets of knowledge, maybe some surprising facts, and the essential context to help you understand this multifaceted phenomenon. We'll present the diverse viewpoints, not to tell you what to think, but really to provide you with a true shortcut to being well-informed about a term that is, frankly, much more than just a fleeting meme.
Definitely. Okay, let's get into it.
Okay, let's unpack this. So to start, I think we all have an image in our heads, right? But what exactly is a Karen at its core? What's the sort of working definition? And what are those archetypal traits that immediately bring that image to mind?
Well, at its core, Karen is defined as a pejorative slang term. That's the baseline.
Okay.
It's typically used to refer to an aggressive, entitled, and sometimes overtly racist, older, middle, or upper-class white woman. That's the definition that really gained significant traction in popular discourse.
And what are the key characteristics then that really define a Karen? Is it just about being demanding, or is there a specific nuance to the way they interact with the world?
It's definitely more nuanced than just being demanding. According to researchers like Heather Suzanne Woods, who studies internet memes quite a bit, a Karen's defining characteristics include a profound sense of entitlement, an almost inherent willingness, maybe even a desire to complain, and a deeply self-centered approach to interacting with others. The core idea is that a Karen demands the world bend to her standards, often with very little regard for anyone else's needs or feelings, She's willing to risk or even actively demean others to achieve her own ends.
Right.
Think about that feeling, maybe you've had it, being in a public space and encountering someone who believes the rules simply don't apply to them, but apply very strictly to everyone else. That's kind of the vibe.
That sounds like a complete disregard for others as individuals then.
Yeah.
Almost seeing them as obstacles rather than, fellow human beings.
Precisely. Rachel Charlene Lewis, writing for Bitch magazine, she really emphasizes this point. She notes that a Karen often doesn't view others as individuals at all.
Wow.
Instead, she moves through the world prepared to fight a faceless conglomerate of lesser-than people who won't give her what she wants and feels she deserves.
That's quite a description.
It really paints a picture, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Someone who sees every interaction as a battle against a system designed to thwart her, rather than a collaborative exchange. It's this sense of being perpetually aggrieved.
And then, of course, there are those instantly recognizable stereotypes that come to mind. The most notable one, the absolute classic, has to be demanding to speak to the manager. Right?
Oh, absolutely.
That's almost synonymous with the term.
That's the quintessential Karen move, definitely. But the stereotype, it actually extends beyond just customer service interactions. Other common associations include things like anti-vaccination beliefs, an almost obsessive presence on Facebook, and even a very specific bob haircut, often blonde highlights or a dramatic angular cut.
Right, the haircut. I've definitely seen that meme.
Exactly. Images of Kate Gosselin and Jenny McCarthy's distinctive bob cuts are frequently used to depict a Karen, to the point where their hairstyles are sometimes humorously, or maybe not so humorously, called the "Can I speak to your manager?" haircut.
Wow.
It's incredible how a specific visual can become so culturally charged and instantly convey a whole set of assumed behaviors, isn't it?
It truly is. Now, for something so widespread, you'd think the origin would be really clear, like a straight line. But it seems there are multiple threads kind of converging here to create this phenomenon, right? How did Karen even begin to take root?
Yeah, you're right. There isn't one single neat origin story. It's much more of a cultural confluence, sort of blending early pop culture influences with internet phenomena.
Okay, like what?
Well, for instance, some sources point to the airheaded, self-absorbed character named Karen from that iconic 2004 film Mean Girls.
Oh, right. Is butter a carb?
That's the one. And then there's also Dane Cook's 2005 comedy sketch called The Friend Nobody Likes, which features a character named Karen whose irritating behaviors just alienate everyone around her. And maybe more recently, a 2016 internet meme featured a woman in a Nintendo Switch ad, and she was nicknamed Antisocial Karen for exhibiting what people saw as, socially awkward or unapproachable behavior.
So these were just sort of early comedic or observational uses of the name. Kind of laying the groundwork, maybe.
Exactly. They subtly laid some groundwork, but where it really started to pick up steam and become this pervasive stereotype we recognize today, that largely happened on Reddit.
Ah, Reddit. Okay, tell me about that.
So in December 2017, a user named KarmaCop9 started posting these really lengthy, increasingly frustrated rants about his ex-wife, whose name, perhaps unsurprisingly, was Karen.
No way.
Yeah. He described her as manipulative and entitled, especially regarding their child custody arrangements. And these raw, sometimes kind of funny posts just resonated with a lot of users.
I can imagine.
It sparked this cascade of related content, and this led directly to the creation of these hugely popular subreddits like R Fuck You Karen, R Katerin, and R Entitled Karens.
Wow.
These communities quickly became these digital spaces dedicated to showcasing, criticizing, and often humorously mocking the entitled or abusive behavior associated with the term. It became a collective, almost cathartic outlet.
That's fascinating how a single Reddit user's personal grievance could spark such a cultural movement. But I've also heard, and this seems really important, that the concept itself has a much deeper history, especially within African American culture, predating the internet entirely.
Yes, this is absolutely crucial, and it really highlights the profound intersectional nature of the term. The concept of using a generic, often pejorative name for difficult, entitled white women, especially those who weaponize their position or privilege, that has a long and significant history within African American culture.
Okay, like what kind of history?
Well, for example, during the antebellum era, so roughly 1815 to 1861, the term Miss Anne was commonly used.
Miss Anne?
Yeah, it was a sarcastic reference to white women, particularly slave owners' wives, who embodied oppressive, often cruel, and entitled behavior towards black people. It was a way of naming that specific kind of power dynamic.
I see.
Then, much later, in the early 1990s, Becky became a popular term, often used to describe a sort of generic, maybe naive or unaware white girl or woman, less overtly malicious than Miss Anne, perhaps, but still signifying a certain kind of white womanhood.
So Karen isn't a completely new phenomenon in terms of this type of social critique. It's more like the latest iteration of a very long-standing cultural practice of naming these dynamics.
Exactly. And before Karen truly caught on, we saw more recent, often alliterative names that popped up after specific incidents went viral on social media.
Right, I remember some of those.
Yeah, think of Barbecue Becky for the white woman who called the police on black men barbecuing in a park, or Corner Store Caroline for a white woman who confronted a black child selling water, and Permit Patty, remember her? Called the police on a black girl selling bottled water without a permit.
Those were everywhere for a while.
These instances show a clear lineage, right? Naming specific manifestations of white entitlement, often involving unnecessary calls to authorities against black people. And linguist Kendra Calhoun also connects the Karen stereotype to the older soccer mom archetype.
Interesting. How so?
Suggesting a kind of continuity in how certain demographics of white women have been perceived for their behavior, particularly their perceived tendency towards, let's say, over-involvement or over-control in public spaces.
And it wasn't just Reddit that helped popularize Karen. I understand Black Twitter, which is such a powerful force in cultural discourse, played a pretty significant role, too.
That's absolutely right. The term was widely popularized on Black Twitter as a meme. It was used to describe white women who would, as one description put it, tattle on black kids' lemonade stands.
Right.
Or, more pointedly, unleash the violent history of white womanhood. That latter phrase is particularly potent, obviously linking the behavior to a much darker history, which we'll definitely dig into more.
Yeah, we need to.
And Bitch magazine even suggested that while the term originated and was primarily used by black women, it was later co-opted by white men for their own uses, sometimes shifting its original critical intent, which really speaks to how language can evolve and be repurposed across different cultural groups, right? Sometimes losing some of its initial specificity or critical edge in the process.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So we had these early pop culture seeds, the Reddit explosion, and this deep, crucial historical precedent in African-American culture. But it really feels like Karen just exploded, became universally recognized and understood in one particular year, 2020. What was it about 2020 that led to that dramatic surge?
Yeah, 2020 was undeniably the year of Karen, as The Guardian famously dubbed it. Its widespread recognition and usage surged mainly because of two huge catalytic events that just consumed global attention: the unfolding COVID-19 pandemic and the massive George Floyd protests against police brutality. These events created this unique environment for the term to both propagate and really deepen its meaning.
And I vividly remember the Central Park incident involving Amy Cooper being such a pivotal moment. Can you elaborate on why that particular event was so significant in cementing the Karen archetype? It felt different.
It was different. The incident involving Amy Cooper was absolutely central to redefining Karen into a truly dangerous archetype, moving it beyond just, annoyance or entitlement.
Okay.
So in May 2020, Amy Cooper, a white woman, called the police on Christian Cooper, no relation, a black birdwatcher. He had simply asked her to leash her dog in a designated on-leash area of Central Park called the Ramble.
Right. The video is chilling.
It was. On video, she explicitly threatened to falsely accuse him of threatening her life, telling the 911 operator, "There's an African-American man threatening my life." She was clearly using her distress, her perceived vulnerability as a white woman, as a weapon against him. This event, caught on video, widely circulated, just starkly highlighted extreme racial bias against minorities, especially black people, and it showed this strong proclivity towards weaponizing police intervention for really mundane transgressions. Yeah. It shifted Karen from just a general nuisance to someone capable of inflicting real, potentially life-threatening harm due to her perceived social privilege and, frankly, the readiness of the state, or at least the perception of the state's readiness, to enforce racial hierarchies based on her word.
So it wasn't just about entitlement anymore. It was about the very real, potentially lethal consequences of that entitlement when wielded by white women against black individuals.
Yeah.
That action became crystal clear.
Precisely. Andre Brock, he's a professor of black digital culture, explains that the virality and impact of videos like Amy Cooper's in 2020 was partly due to what he calls an interest convergence.
Interest convergence. Okay, what does that mean?
Basically, the pandemic forced millions of people home, right? Creating this massive captive audience with ample free time and, heightened engagement with online content. People were scrolling. This situation converged powerfully with the collective outrage over police brutality and racial injustice, particularly boiling over after George Floyd's murder. So the videos, like Amy Cooper's, viscerally highlighted the extreme violence and potentially fatal consequences of a white woman selfishly calling the cops out of spite and professed fear. The public visibility of these incidents forced a broader reckoning, providing a concrete face, a name even, to the abstract concept of white privilege being weaponized.
It's clear that the Amy Cooper incident, alongside the broader social climate of 2020, cemented Karen as a cultural milestone. It made it a term that reflects much deeper societal issues, particularly those around race and privilege. Let's delve into that now. Karen as a racial archetype. Time magazine had a pretty strong characterization of this, didn't they?
They did, yeah. Time magazine characterized the Karen meme as, and I'm quoting here, internet shorthand for a particular kind of racial violence white women have instigated for centuries, following a long and troubling legacy of white women in the country weaponizing their victimhood. That phrasing really highlights that the stereotype isn't just about individual bad behavior. It's seen as part of a recognizable, dangerous pattern deeply rooted in American history and its power dynamics.
Weaponizing victimhood. That's such a powerful and, frankly, disturbing phrase.
Yeah.
How exactly does that connect to historical narratives in America? Where does that idea come from?
Well, the narrative of white women's inherent purity and victimhood is deeply entrenched in American history. It particularly dates back to myths constructed during the era of American slavery.
Right.
Black slaves, especially black men, were falsely posited as sexual threats to white women. This was a pervasive and utterly false accusation, often used to justify unspeakable violence against black people.
Right, when the reality was often the reverse.
Exactly. In reality, it was often white slave masters who were raping enslaved black women. But this pervasive ideology, this myth, perpetuated the dangerous idea that white women, who represented the good and the moral in American society, needed to be protected by white men at all costs. And this narrative thereby justified brutal racial violence and extrajudicial killings like lynchings towards black men and anyone perceived as a threat to white male power structures.
And there are examples of this in culture.
Oh, absolutely. A harrowing example is the 1915 film Birth of a Nation. It notoriously glorified the Ku Klux Klan and depicted black men as predatory, savagely assaulting white women. That film directly exemplified this harmful narrative and is often cited as inspiring the KKK's resurgence in the 20th century. It shows how powerful these cultural narratives can be.
So this isn't a new phenomenon at all, then. It's more like an enduring archetype, a pattern of behavior that has simply found a new, very catchy name in Karen.
Absolutely. Media researcher Meredith Clark notes that the underlying concept, the idea of a white woman in whose vicinity black people feel an urgent need to be careful because she wouldn't hesitate to use her privilege at others' expense, often by crying distress or calling the authorities. She says that concept has always been there.
Right.
It just hadn't always been so specific to a single, widely recognized name like Karen. And you can see this troubling continuity today. Contemporary Karens have been explicitly compared to historical figures like Carolyn Bryant.
Emmett Till's accuser.
Exactly. The white woman whose false accusation that Emmett Till Wolf whistled at her led to his horrific lynching in 1955, a truly pivotal moment in the civil rights movement. Or, if you look at literature, Mayella Ewell from To Kill a Mockingbird, who falsely accuses Tom Robinson, a black man, of rape. These comparisons really underscore how this archetype persists across time, carrying immense social and personal weight and connecting present-day incidents to that long history.
It sounds like Karen is serving as a kind of shorthand, then, for a very specific, dangerous manifestation of white privilege, particularly when it intersects with this historical propensity for white women's perceived vulnerability to be exploited for racial control.
That's a very good way to put it. April Williams at the University of Michigan even describes Karen as a black activist meme.
Interesting. What does she mean by that?
She suggests that while it is ultimately beneficial in helping people recognize problematic behaviors and maybe hold them accountable, there's also a crucial warning.
Okay.
That jokes and memes, while powerful tools for critique, can sometimes inadvertently downplay the serious, even existential threat posed to black individuals in these encounters.
Right, because the consequences can be so severe.
Exactly. As Williams points out, the routine act of calling the police on black people in public spaces extends this historical practice of regulating black bodies to maintain white supremacist order. That connection is key. It emphasizes the profound impact these seemingly minor, everyday incidents can have, linking them directly to larger systems of oppression.
Okay, this brings us right to a major point of contention and the core of the debate itself. Is the term Karen inherently racist because it specifically targets white women, or is it a legitimate, even necessary critique of a specific harmful behavior tied to privilege? It seems like some critics definitely argue the former.
Yes, that argument is certainly made, and it leads to considerable contention online and offline. Some folks on platforms like Reddit, for example, like a user named Morrisane we saw in the sources, directly question why it's often framed as misogynistic but not also racist, given its specific demographic target.
Right.
The discussion often circles back to whether critiquing a behavior that seems to disproportionately appear in one group is inherently discriminatory itself, regardless of the historical context or power dynamics involved.
And there's been this very controversial comparison made, the idea of Karen being the N-word for white women. How has that claim been received and analyzed? That seems like a really inflammatory comparison.
It is highly inflammatory, and that comparison has been largely and quite forcefully rejected by many commentators and experts, including prominent figures like Karina Attia, who's the global opinions editor for The Washington Post.
Okay.
She asserts, and most experts seem to concur, that Karen fundamentally lacks the centuries of historical context, the systemic power imbalance, the brutal violence, and the deeply embedded dehumanization necessary to be considered a slur in the same category as the N-word.
Right, the comparison just doesn't hold up historically or systemically.
Exactly. Calling it that, Adia and others argue, actually trivializes the real violent discrimination faced by truly marginalized groups over centuries. The general consensus is that the comparison is inaccurate and inappropriate, largely because the term Karen, at least in its critical usage, arguably originates from an experience of oppression, while the N-word is unequivocally a tool of oppression. The power dynamic is reversed.
That's a stark reminder of the fundamental differences in historical oppression and power dynamics. Okay, so what about the idea of racial targeting more generally? Does the original intent, or even the common usage of Karen, truly target white people in a discriminatory way, according to the sources?
Well, the original Reddit poster, Karma Cop 9, for instance, stated that they didn't feel white people were particularly targeted, at least not in a way that equates to systemic oppression. They argued, essentially, that our culture already has stereotypes about loud, aggressive, or demanding people of color, citing examples like the stereotype of the loud, domineering black woman or the criminal or thuggish black man stereotype.
I see. So the argument is that stereotypes exist for many groups.
Right. But then the user, more assane, pushed back on this, asking, well, if we gave a specific widely used name to those stereotypes, would that then make them racist slurs?
Ah, okay. That complicates it.
It does. It's a really complex line to walk, doesn't it? It raises difficult questions about who gets to define what constitutes a slur and whether a critical term can be considered racist if it targets a group that holds historical and systemic power.
So it really raises a crucial question that lies at the heart of this entire discussion. When does a term move beyond legitimate social commentary and critique and potentially become a form of prejudice itself? And maybe even more importantly, who ultimately gets to make that determination? Is it intent? Is it impact?
It's precisely that dilemma. This whole segment highlights that very complex line between critiquing a specific behavior, particularly when that behavior is demonstrably linked to a pervasive history of racial oppression and unequal power dynamics, and the potential for such a critique to be perceived or even misused as a form of prejudice against the targeted group. The debate really centers on where that line is drawn and whether the intent behind using the term outweighs its perceived impact or vice versa, especially as the term becomes more generalized and maybe loses some of its original critical focus.
And that leads us directly into the other major lens for analyzing Karen, the gendered lens. While the racial implications are undeniable and often central, there's also a powerful argument that the term is deeply misogynistic and is being used to silence women. Interestingly, the original Reddit poster, the very creator of R Fuck You Karen, actually voiced this concern from the very beginning, didn't they? Even as the term gained popularity.
That's a really important detail that often gets overlooked, I think, in the broader, more heated discussions. The original Reddit poster explicitly stated their concern that, quote, the anti-Karen anger is rooted in our society's fear and dislike of women who speak up or exert power.
Wow, from the source itself.
Yeah. They worried that the term was being used similarly to older, clearly misogynistic insults like shrew or bitch, and they even worried it could be politically weaponized against female politicians or, really, any woman who dares to assert herself publicly or voice a strong opinion.
So the very person who helped popularize the term was already aware of its inherent potential for misuse and weaponization against women more broadly. What are some of the stronger critiques that highlight Karen as a misogynistic tool, something that actively impacts women's voices?
There are several powerful arguments that come up in the sources. Hadley Freeman, a columnist for The Guardian, she contended that the use of the meme has dangerously shifted. It's gone from merely describing a specific type of entitled behavior to actively controlling behavior.
How so?
Essentially functioning as a cultural command to tell women to shut up. Just label them a Karen and dismiss whatever they're saying. And writer Jennifer Weiner shared a very personal experience during the COVID-19 pandemic. She admitted the meme had actually succeeded in silencing her. She found herself hesitating to complain about legitimate issues like someone coughing openly near her in public or people ignoring social distancing rules, purely out of fear of immediately being labeled a Karen and having her concerns dismissed.
That's a profound impact, actively silencing women from expressing legitimate concerns or even engaging in basic social accountability. It really highlights how a meme can have real-world chilling effects on behavior.
It absolutely does. And Helen Lewis, writing for The Atlantic, she vividly described what she calls the finger trap of the term.
The finger trap.
Yeah, she insightfully stated that Karen has effectively become synonymous with woman among those who consider woman an insult. And the ultimate paradox, the trap, is that complaining about being called a Karen only makes you seem more like one in the eyes of those using the term dismissively.
Ah, right. What's more Karen than complaining about being called Karen?
Exactly, that's the quote. This creates this powerful, self-reinforcing incentive for women to simply stay silent, even when they have valid grievances or wish to assert themselves. It's a no-win situation. So critics widely argue that the term prevents women from speaking up for themselves and is, quote, the most recent millennial-sanctioned attempt to keep women in their place. Basically, a modern evolution of age-old patriarchal control mechanisms just wrapped in meme culture.
That's incredibly insidious. And
Yeah.
it's not just about silencing, is it? It's also about judging them more harshly and pigeonholing them with other negative stereotypes.
Precisely. Journalist Julie Bindel directly questioned if Karen was woman-hating and based on class prejudice, and Hadley Freeman concurred, calling it sexist, ageist, and classist in that order. The term is widely criticized for fueling misogynistic stereotypes by pairing this idea of entitled behavior with other pejorative labels often aimed at women, like shrill or loudmouthed, and critically for judging women far more harshly than men for exhibiting similar or even identical behaviors. It creates this clear double standard where male aggression might be seen as assertive or strong, while female assertiveness gets quickly labeled as Karen-like.
And tragically, beyond the broader societal critique, there's a very real personal impact for women who literally share the name Karen. I mean, this isn't just an abstract discussion for them, is it?
No, it's not abstract at all. It's incredibly painful for many. A recent study actually found that women genuinely named Karen have experienced significant negative impacts on their mental health, all due to the pervasive disrespect and abuse associated with their name now.
Like what kind of impacts?
Well, the study reported things like verbal threats, online and offline harassment, social ostracization, and even frightening instances of physical assaults, just because their name is Karen.
That's awful.
It is. This phenomenon has been tragically compared to nameism, which is similar to the discrimination and prejudice experienced by those bearing names historically used as racial or cultural slurs. It's a truly disheartening and likely unforeseen consequence of a widely used meme becoming so toxic.
Yeah, absolutely awful. Given all this discussion about Karen being so distinctly gendered, both in its application and its critique, why is it so difficult to find a universally recognized, equally culturally potent male counterpart? The original Reddit poster observed this asymmetry too, right? That feels significant.
They absolutely did. The OP noted, and it's a critical observation that keeps coming up, that there is no similar stereotype for men, and the much rarer term male Karen actually tends to reinforce the idea that entitled aggression is a typically female behavior.
Right. Calling him a male Karen still centers the female term.
Exactly. This observation really strikes at the heart of the gendered critique and the perceived double standard. If this kind of entitled behavior is so universal, why is the most prominent name for it so gender-specific?
But don't some argue that the specific type of behavior, the complaining, the demanding to see the manager, the weaponizing of calls to authority, is disproportionately exhibited by women, or at least manifested differently by men? I've certainly seen that argument made in online discussions.
Yes, that argument does come up. Some commenters, like a Reddit user named Kurt Wagner 1984, mentioned in the sources, asserted that the specific type of entitled, complaining behavior attributed to Karen is disproportionately exhibited by women, particularly maybe in service industry interactions where staff might encounter female customers more often or perceive them differently. They further argued that when men freak out, as they put it, their aggression often manifests differently. It usually ends up in a fight and ends up in R-fight porn where most of the people depicted are men.
Okay, so a difference in how aggression is expressed.
That's the argument. It suggests a difference in how male versus female aggression is typically manifested, perceived, and consequently named or maybe even dismissed in popular culture. Male aggression might be framed as physical or simply being an asshole, while female aggression gets coded as verbal, entitled, and specifically Karen-like.
Have there been attempts to name a male Karen, though? I feel like I've heard a few names floating around, but none seem to have truly stuck in the same way. What are some of those suggestions, and why do you think they haven't achieved the same cultural resonance?
That's correct. There have definitely been attempts, while names like Ken, which got used for Patricia McCloskey's husband in that infamous St. Louis incident where they confronted protesters with guns.
Right, Ken and Karen.
Exactly. Or Kevin, which comes from a different Reddit meme, usually about someone being intellectually inept or clueless, or Chad, often associated with hypermasculine, sometimes arrogant behavior like a frat bro, or even Kyle, often used for aggressive, maybe monster energy drinking teenagers who punch drywall.
Right, right.
While those have all been suggested, none have gained the same widespread cultural currency and immediate universal recognition as Karen. There is no single dominant male equivalent that instantly evokes the same precise set of behaviors and, crucially, the same historical baggage.
It's true. The closest historical parallel might be that Jim Crow-era term, Mr. Charlie, as a male equivalent to Miss Anne.
Right.
But as you said, that's not in modern common usage at all.
Not at all.
So why do you think that is? Why no male Karen equivalent that sticks? Are male-coded insults just different or perhaps less impactful? Or do they simply not generate the same level of societal outrage or collective shaming?
That's a key question, isn't it? And it really points to potentially deeper societal blind spots. Some argue that the existing male-coded insults, we have things like toxic masculinity, which describes a broader system, not really an individual archetype, or neckbeard, associated more with social awkwardness, or frat bro, specific to a certain social group, or just plain old asshole or dick. That these are either less impactful, less widely applied to men as a whole category, or they just don't generate the same level of pervasive societal outrage and public shaming as Karen seems to.
But is that actually true? Is male incivility not mocked?
Well, that's where a Reddit user named Nukemi Country made a really forceful counter-argument in the discussions we looked at. They asserted that mocking male incivility is deeply ingrained in our culture, but it manifests in different, perhaps equally damaging ways, and has serious consequences that are often overlooked or dismissed.
Okay, what examples did Nukemi Country give to illustrate that point? That sounds important.
They provided some striking and, often uncomfortable examples. They noted how society tends to perceive male nudity primarily as a joke, often used for comedic effect in movies and TV, while female nudity is typically framed as either beautiful or purely sexual, but rarely comical in the same dismissive way.
Interesting point.
They brought up the emergence of terms like big dick energy and small dick energy, arguing that such jokes, while maybe seemingly innocuous to some, socially punish men for a part of their body over which they have no control, implicitly tying a man's worth or confidence to perceived virility in a way that's quite demeaning. They also pointed out that men are often heavily conditioned socially to express their reactions privately, to man up, leading to them sometimes being mocked for speaking up against mockery. They might even be called misogynistic slurs like pussy to demean them for showing emotion or objecting to being insulted.
Yeah, that definitely happens.
And perhaps most powerfully, they highlighted the profound and often unacknowledged suffering of men who are falsely accused of serious crimes like rape. They face severe, life-altering consequences to their lives, reputations, and careers, often feeling like they have no one on his side, due to societal biases that can sometimes lean against male victimhood or credibility in those contexts.
Wow. Those are really strong examples suggesting that societal mockery and its consequences do exist for men, but perhaps in different forms or arenas than the public Karen shaming.
Exactly. It's a powerful point about the different ways societal pressures, insults, and mockery play out across genders. It sounds like the difficulty in establishing a universally recognized male Karen isn't just a linguistic quirk, maybe. It might reveal deeper societal blind spots about how male entitlement is expressed, normalized, or perhaps categorized differently.
That makes sense. It absolutely does. This difficulty raises these important questions about how we, as a society, perceive and critique aggressive or entitled behavior. It forces us to ask how gender influences the public's perception of incivility, right? And whether different forms of aggression are treated with different levels of seriousness or get different kinds of labels based on the gender of the perpetrator.
It suggests that while male entitlement certainly exists and definitely manifests aggressively, it might be categorized or dismissed differently in the cultural lexicon. Perhaps it's seen more often as individual asshole behavior, like you said, rather than being recognized as a systemic archetype worthy of its own catchy, universally understood name.
So, given all this complexity, the really potent racial implications, the very valid gendered critiques, the historical baggage, how do we, as a society, and just as individuals trying to navigate this, how do we discern between a woman legitimately speaking up for herself or others and what's deemed misplaced aggression or Karen behavior? especially when there are such strong, often deeply ingrained gendered expectations around how women are supposed to communicate.
That's the critical challenge, isn't it? And a really important area for nuanced thought. Some perspectives we encountered argue that the Karen archetype, when used critically and precisely, is specifically defined by misplaced aggression.
Misplaced aggression, meaning?
Meaning, for example, berating a low-wage retail worker who has absolutely no control over corporate policy, rather than engaging in appropriate assertive communication, like, say, negotiating firmly but respectfully with a car salesman, or speaking up effectively in a business meeting to advocate for one's rights or point out an injustice.
Yeah.
This perspective suggests that Karen describes women who are being mean, disrespectful, and abusive, particularly towards those with less power, not necessarily women who are simply being powerful or assertive in advocating for themselves legitimately. It's about the target and the method of the complaint, not just the act of complaining itself.
But on the other hand, we have that very real concern voiced by the original poster and many others that the label itself can be, and often is, weaponized to shut down women who are speaking up legitimately, maybe even against sexism, racism, or other forms of injustice. It becomes a convenient, quick way to dismiss their concerns entirely.
Exactly. This is the central concern. They fear that the Karen label can be used as a blunt instrument to silence women who are merely asserting themselves, voicing valid complaints, or advocating for others. It conflates legitimate female assertiveness with entitled abusive aggression. And this segment really highlights that extremely fine, often blurry line. It urges us to question how societal expectations about female communication styles, the persistent idea that women should always be nice or polite or accommodating, can heavily influence our perception of what constitutes appropriate versus inappropriate assertiveness. It's perhaps the difference between speaking up to challenge power and speaking down to abuse it.
That distinction is crucial. This exploration really sets the stage perfectly for our next section, which delves into arguably the deepest, most complex layer of the Karen phenomenon, the intersectional critiques. We'll be looking at concepts like essentialism, power dynamics, and that powerful framing question posed by Kimberly Crenshaw. What difference makes. And there's a long-standing historical rift between, let's say, mainstream white feminism and black feminist critiques that is incredibly relevant here, isn't it?
Absolutely. To truly understand the nuances here, we need to bring in the insights of feminist theorists, particularly around intersectionality. Consider Catherine McKinnon, who's a prominent, sometimes controversial, radical feminist theorist.
Okay.
She described the historical white woman stereotype think Miss Anne, again, as privileged, protected, flighty, and self-indulgent, noting how this archetype could historically manipulate white men's power, often against black people. However, McKinnon also argued passionately that fixating solely on the privileges white women might possess due to their race often critically overlooks the very real systemic struggles they face precisely because they are women.
What kind of struggles are we talking about that, in her view, get overlooked when the focus is only on racial privilege? What's being missed?
McKinnon powerfully highlighted statistics and realities showing that despite any racial privilege, white women still constitute the majority of the poor globally and nationally. They disproportionately experience domestic violence, and they are frequently murdered by intimate partners. For her, asserting that white women are somehow free of subjugation simply because they are white erases a dynamic of womanness that anyone interested in gender equality should take seriously. She believed focusing on shared gender experiences, the commonalities of female subjugation under patriarchy, was absolutely crucial for achieving overall female liberation, regardless of race, because it identified male dominance as the primary systemic issue affecting all women, albeit in different ways.
But this argument, I gather, rings hollow, and perhaps rightly so for many black feminists, given their own distinct experiences and the history of the feminist movement itself.
It certainly does, and this is where that historical rift becomes really apparent. Black feminism emerged precisely from the profound critique that mainstream, predominantly white feminists had historically, and often inadvertently perhaps, erased or sidelined the voices and unique experiences of women of color. A notable and often cited example dates way back to the 1800s, during the fight for suffrage. Early white feminists like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, while advocating powerfully for women's right to vote, controversially lobbied against the passage of the 15th Amendment.
Which gave black men the vote.
Right. It extended voting rights to black men, and they explicitly argued it created antagonism everywhere between educated, refined women and the lower orders of men, especially in the South. This reveals a clear prioritization of white women's suffrage over universal male suffrage, regardless of race, and highlighted a willingness to leverage racist tropes to achieve their specific goals.
That's a really stark illustration of how race could be prioritized over universal suffrage, or even over solidarity by some prominent white feminists, leading to a profound and lasting schism. So this brings us to the core of the essentialism debate within feminism, right?
Yes, exactly. A key critique of what's often termed white feminist writing or activism by Black feminists is that it is often essentialist, meaning it tends to assign a universal, singular womanness to all women, a kind of one-size-fits-all approach to female experience that, in practice, inadvertently centers the particular and often privileged experiences of white, often middle-class women.
Can you give an example?
Sure. For example, discussing the glass ceiling as the primary women's issue in the workplace might completely overlook the unique struggles a Black woman faces navigating both sexism and pervasive racial bias in that same corporate environment. Or it might ignore the daily realities of women living in poverty, whose challenges related to gender might be fundamentally different from a white middle-class woman's experience of sexism.
Right.
Black feminism, in contrast, strives to center the specific lived experiences of women of color, recognizing their distinct challenges and the multiple intersecting axes of oppression they face: racism, sexism, classism, etc.
Yeah. This sounds like a fundamental and deeply important disagreement within feminist thought about strategy, focus, and whose experiences get centered. How does Kimberly Crenshaw, the scholar who famously coined the term intersectionality, navigate this complex terrain between McKinnon's focus on universal male dominance and Black feminism's emphasis on specificity and difference?
Kimberly Crenshaw, whose Intersectionalities workshop loosely inspired one of our sources, is such a crucial figure here, offering a potential path to synthesize these sometimes conflicting views. Interestingly, the source mentions she does teach McKinnon's writings in her workshops, despite acknowledging student resistance to some of McKinnon's positions.
Why does she do that?
Crenshaw apparently views McKinnon as one of the few white feminist writers who confronts Black feminist critiques and the problem of essentialism directly, rather than just engaging in what Crenshaw calls superficial gestures of inclusion, just adding women of color to the analysis without fundamentally changing the framework. So Crenshaw sees value in engaging with McKinnon's perspective rigorously, even while acknowledging its limitations and the historical context of how it might be received.
Okay, so Crenshaw sees value in that direct engagement. And how does McKinnon, in turn, offer a counter-critique? Does she see a potential essentialism within some Black feminist thought as well?
That's where the conversation becomes even more nuanced and complex. McKinnon, in turn, argued that Black feminists could inadvertently fall into their own form of essentialism by sometimes becoming overly focused on theories of identity politics over concrete, lived experience.
How so?
She suggested that by focusing perhaps too intently on how a proposed white feminist solution might theoretically erase Black women's specific experiences, they could inadvertently miss instances where that solution could, in fact, help all women as a class by addressing a fundamental aspect of gender-based subordination common to most women.
Right.
For McKinnon, feminism was primarily a practical political movement focused on ending male dominance long before it became a highly developed academic theory. Her recommendation, therefore, is always to begin feminist analysis with concrete, lived experiences to better understand the true material source of female subjugation, which she identifies fundamentally as male dominance, as it manifests across different contexts and intersects with other forms of oppression.
Can you give us some legal examples that might illustrate McKinnon's point? Cases where broad, woman-centered victories ultimately benefited all women, regardless of race, even when the initial focus wasn't explicitly or solely on intersectionality from the outset?
Certainly. McKinnon points to the landmark 1986 Supreme Court case Meritor Savings Bank v. Vinson. This case crucially involved a Black woman plaintiff named Michelle Vinson. Her lawsuit against her employer for repeated sexual assault and harassment was absolutely pivotal in establishing sexual harassment as a legally recognized form of sex-based discrimination under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act.
Okay.
The outcome of that single case, brought by a Black woman detailing her specific experience of gendered harm, fundamentally changed the theory of sex discrimination for all women, setting a legal precedent that profoundly benefited women of all races by creating a framework to challenge workplace harassment.
That's a great example. Any others?
Similarly, she cites California Federal Savings and Loan Association v. Guerra, another important case which upheld state laws requiring employers to provide pregnancy leave. These arguments, McKinnon notes, were based on the plaintiffs' lives as women, highlighting a shared hierarchy of inequality that affected women as a class due to concrete legal and social deprivations like disenfranchisement, economic exclusion, or the biological reality of pregnancy simply because they were women. These rulings addressed female-specific disadvantages.
So her point, if I understand it, is that sometimes race, while obviously incredibly important, can be non-operational in a specific analytical context, meaning it's not always the primary axis of oppression being addressed or the most effective strategic lens for achieving a specific legal or social reform that benefits women across racial lines in that particular instance.
Exactly. That's a good summary of her argument. McKinnon argues that sometimes automatically elevating race over gender in every single analysis can inadvertently harm Black women by obscuring their unique vulnerabilities as women. She points out, for instance, that Black women were still disenfranchised even after the 15th Amendment granted voting rights to Black men. She emphasizes that Black women are disproportionately sexually assaulted as women, often regardless of the race of the perpetrator. And she notes, controversially but historically, that Black women face significant misogyny and sexism from some prominent male leaders within Black power organizations. She cites figures like Eldridge Cleaver, a well-known Black Panther leader who controversially wrote about perpetrating sexual violence against both Black and white women as a political act.
Right.
So McKinnon poses this very provocative, maybe uncomfortable question. Why might some Black feminists, in her view, give an easier time to misogynists who share their race than racists who share their gender? It suggests a difficult, perhaps impossible choice in prioritizing allegiances or forms of oppression when they intersect or conflict.
That's a very challenging question, and I can definitely see why it would cause strong reactions. McKinnon also theorizes about something she calls a useless white woman aversion. What does she mean by that in this context, and how does she think it plays into the dynamics of alliance between women of different races?
McKinnon suggests that part of the unease or reluctance among some feminists of color in fully aligning politically or ideologically with white women stems from an aversion to being placed in the same social category as the stereotype of the useless white woman whose first reaction when the going gets rough is to cry.
Okay, that stereotype.
Yeah. This stereotype is not only seen as undignified and disempowering, she argues, but it also carries a societal burden. Society, historically and currently, more readily sees and grants rights to groups that include men such as Black people as a whole community, which includes Black men, than to groups perceived as solely or primarily female.
Interesting point.
She implies that the negative construction of white women stereotypes, which often positions them as weak, overly emotional, or self-pitying, like the Karen crying, can actually make it harder for women as a class to gain recognition and legitimacy for their unique struggles, and simultaneously makes it harder, perhaps, for women of color to form trusting political alliances with white women, fearing association with that negative stereotype.
So Crenshaw, despite the potential resistance from her students, finds these arguments from McKinnon useful for prompting a deeper, more rigorous intersectional analysis, it seems. What's Crenshaw's ultimate critique, then, of these perceived double standards and how intersectional analyses are sometimes applied in practice?
Crenshaw is indeed described as sympathetic to McKinnon's arguments regarding what they both perceive as a potential double standard, in how intersectional critiques can sometimes be applied selectively or unevenly.
Okay, how so?
Crenshaw notes, for example, that anti-racist male writers often essentialize Black people when discussing issues like segregation or racial profiling. They might speak of what Black people experienced historically without always explicitly accounting for the significant gender differences within that experience. They might not detail the distinct impacts on Black men versus Black women in that situation.
Right, often just Black people.
Exactly. Yet, Crenshaw observes, as soon as a white woman talks about sexism affecting women as a general class, she is often quickly reprimanded for not being intersectional enough, for not sufficiently foregrounding the experiences of women of color in every single utterance or analysis.
That's a powerful observation about consistency and critique. It sounds like McKinnon points out, relatedly, that when women of color refer to people who look like me, it's generally understood to mean people of color, not necessarily women of color, even though both race and sex are, as she puts it, visual assignments. Both possess clarity as well as ambiguity, and both are marks of oppression, hence community.
Precisely. This comparison highlights a potential selective application of intersectional critique, where certain forms of group identification or essentialism are accepted or go unnoticed, while others are heavily scrutinized. This can lead to uneven expectations for different speakers based on their identity. Both McKinnon and Crenshaw, despite their different starting points and areas of emphasis, ultimately arrive at a shared concern for the consequences of difference, urging us to be mindful and rigorous in how we apply these nuanced concepts.
So for McKinnon, what's the inherent risk of over-focusing on differences between women? What does she believe that might prevent strategically?
For McKinnon, focusing too much on differences between women, while absolutely crucial for recognizing specific harms and ensuring inclusivity, may inadvertently prevent the development of new, unifying, women-centric conceptions of equality that could ultimately benefit everyone, potentially even across genders, by challenging patriarchal norms. She argues that smaller, identity-specific group victories, while vital in themselves, might not bring women as a broad class closer to the overarching goal of eliminating systemic male domination. She fears that without a robust women-centered view that acknowledges shared vulnerabilities, equality simply becomes about women obtaining the rights and privileges that men already possess within the existing system, rather than fundamentally changing the system to accommodate female realities, like pregnancy leave or protection from sexual harassment, which required seeing women as women.
And Crenshaw's final takeaway on this, the one that seems most applicable for navigating these complex issues in practice, is really important, isn't it? It's about moving beyond rigid dogma or preset conclusions.
It is. It's incredibly practical. Crenshaw ultimately emphasizes that fetishizing difference, that is, obsessing over distinctions where they do not actually make a substantive difference to the specific analysis or the practical outcome, can be just as harmful as erasure. It can paralyze action by creating endless divisions or diverting focus from the core issue at hand. She concludes that true, effective intersectionality calls for the careful, rigorous analysis of specific situations and concrete power dynamics, rather than relying on prepackaged ideological groupings or pre-mapped conclusions based solely on identity categories.
So it's less about applying a formula and more about deep analysis of the facts.
Exactly. It's a powerful reminder that truly effective intersectional analysis means really analyzing the facts and specific harms at hand and making a sound, evidence-based conclusion about what difference a difference makes to the particular situation you're trying to understand or change. What axis of the power is most salient here?
So focusing on specific individual actions and patterns of behavior and how power is actually being wielded in those moments might get us to the truth faster, or at least to a more useful analysis than relying solely on rigid, abstract categories or simply listing identities. This leaves us with some crucial, lingering questions, doesn't it? Like, does the concept of Karen, with its sometimes narrow focus on a specific demographic of white women, partially let white people who don't fully map onto the archetype off the hook for systemic racism?
That's a really important question. Does it inadvertently narrow the focus so much?
Yeah. And what about white men for whom, as we discussed, there is still no universally agreed upon name for equivalent, entitled, or racially problematic behavior, despite its obvious prevalence? Does the focus on Karen distract from that?
These are precisely the deep, challenging questions that this complex discussion, drawing on decades of feminist thought and current events, leaves us with. It forces us to move beyond simplistic definition and meme-level understanding to engage with the messy, often uncomfortable reality of how power, privilege, identity, and stereotypes intersect in our society. It's really about striving for intellectual honesty and being rigorously analytical in our public discourse, rather than just reacting.
This deep dive has really shown us just how much there is to unpack with a seemingly simple meme like Karen. I mean, from its origins in comedy and personal grievances on Reddit, all the way to its profound racial and gendered implications rooted in centuries of history, Karen has become a true cultural touchstone, hasn't it?
It really has.
Let's take a moment now to reflect on some of the lingering echoes and real-world impacts of Karen as it continues to evolve and circulate. You've even seen it enter the commercial sphere, which really shows just how deeply it's permeated our culture, right?
Yes, absolutely. The term has definitely permeated beyond just memes and online social critique. It's infiltrated real-world applications and even, bizarrely, commerce. For instance, in early 2022, a business actually launched called Karens for Hire.
Seriously, Karens for Hire, what do they do?
Yeah. This service charges a fee to help people who have legitimate complaints against companies. They essentially offer to be the assertive, persistent voice that people might now fear being labeled a Karen for if they did it themselves.
Wow, that's fascinating reflection of how the stereotype has been recognized and even commodified. Talk about irony.
Right. And even major brands like Domino's Pizza apparently attempted to capitalize on it briefly with a free pizza for nice Karens offer, though they later rescinded it after significant backlash. Which just shows how quickly the cultural landscape and sensitivities around these terms can shift, and how fraught trying to engage with them commercially can be.
That's a bold and somewhat awkward move for a business, trying to leverage the very stereotype it claims to be pushing back against. But on the flip side, we've also seen powerful counter-narratives emerge, right? Groups that explicitly defy the Karen stereotype by using their position differently. The Wall of Moms movement comes immediately to mind from 2020.
Absolutely, that's a fantastic example. In 2020, during the height of the Black Lives Matter protests against police brutality, the Wall of Moms movement gained significant national and international attention. This group, primarily composed of middle-class, middle-aged white women, formed a physical barrier, linking arms between protesters and federal agents in cities like Portland. They were widely seen by activists and commentators as explicitly not being Karens.
Right, the anti-Karen in a way.
Exactly. They were seen as using their privilege not to oppress or demand service, but to protect others and stand in solidarity. They leveraged their social position and the perceived safety that comes with being white women in that context to protest against systemic racism and classism. They effectively turned the stereotype on its head and actively used their position for positive social change, demonstrating a very different form of female assertiveness in public space.
It's also interesting, as you touched on earlier, to see how this phenomenon isn't just limited to the U.S. or English-speaking cultures. Are there global parallels to the Karen phenomenon, maybe showing a more universal human tendency to stereotype certain kinds of behavior, particularly from women?
Yes, our sources did mention similar terms and archetypes cropping up in other cultures, which does demonstrate the universality of this type of social critique and the impulse to name certain behaviors. For instance, there's a Filipino slang term, marites. Yeah, minorities. It apparently bears a somewhat similar connotation, often referring humorously to a stereotypical gossip monger or someone excessively interested in others' affairs, though it seems to be generally used in a more lighthearted, less overtly critical or politically charged way than Karen often is.
Okay. Any others?
And in Poland, there's the term madka, M-A-D-K-A. It's often used with a critical or pejorative tone to describe a certain type of mother perceived as overbearing, entitled, or demanding special treatment because she has children. Again, highlighting a specific cultural archetype of problematic female behavior. These parallels show that while the specific name Karen and its deep historical baggage might be unique to the U.S. context, the societal impulse to name, categorize, and critique perceived entitled or annoying behavior, particularly from women in public, seems to be pretty cross-cultural.
So the phenomenon of giving a name to a specific undesirable female behavior isn't unique. But circling back to the silencing effect we discussed, that finger trap described by Helen Lewis, it seems like a really powerful, almost self-perpetuating mechanism for shutting down critique of the term itself.
It truly is. That paradox of complaint, the idea that complaining about being called a Karen just makes you seem more like one, is a potent rhetorical device. It acts as an incredibly effective silencing mechanism. It creates this self-reinforcing loop that actively discourages women from speaking out against the label or its misuse, effectively insulating the term from criticism. It becomes a social trap. The more you object, the more you seem to confirm the stereotype in the eyes of those wielding it dismissively. There's almost no way to win that argument once the label is applied.
And what's the ultimate overarching impact of that trap on female voice and agency in public discourse, according to the critics?
Well, the critics widely argue that the term Karen, especially in its broader, less precise usage, is characterized as a controlling term for women's behavior. They contend it actively prevents women from speaking up for themselves, even about legitimate issues. It functions, as one writer vividly put it, as the most recent millennial-sanctioned attempt to keep women in their place. This suggests a significant chilling effect on women's assertiveness, potentially forcing them to self-censor their valid concerns or demands for fear of being publicly shamed, stereotyped, and ultimately dismissed, thereby limiting their participation and influence in public life.
This has been a truly deep dive into a surprisingly complex and culturally significant term. What are the key insights, the main takeaways we really want listeners to hold on to from this intricate discussion about Karen?
Yeah, it's a lot to process. I think first and foremost, this deep dive into Karen reveals that it's far, far more than just a simple internet joke or a fleeting meme.
Right.
It's a really complex reflection of deeply ingrained societal issues concerning race, gender, class, and the exercise and often the abuse of power. It's a shorthand that taps into centuries of American history and current, often painful social dynamics.
So it's not just a surface-level critique. It taps into these deep historical roots and power structures. It's got weight.
Exactly, it has weight. And that leads directly to the second crucial insight, the absolute importance of nuance in discussing it. Understanding Karen requires looking beyond quick binary judgments. Is it racist or sexist? It's often more complicated. It's about acknowledging the very real and sometimes dangerous impact of white women weaponizing their privilege, especially against marginalized groups, recognizing that as a historical pattern with serious consequences that needs critique, while simultaneously, and just as critically, considering the potential for the term itself to be misused as a blunt misogynistic tool to silence or discredit any woman who speaks up, even those with legitimate grievances or who are simply asserting themselves. It's a real dual-edged sword.
Acknowledging both sides of that coin is key. And finally, what's your role, the listener's role, as informed individuals trying to navigate this critical and often highly charged discourse responsibly?
That's maybe the most important takeaway. This exploration really highlights the critical importance of always asking that question inspired by Crenshaw. What difference does difference make in any specific situation you encounter or analyze?
Okay.
It challenges you, the listener, to look beyond broad stereotypes and abstract identity categories. Instead, it encourages you to analyze specific behaviors, observe concrete power dynamics as they play out, and understand the relevant historical and social contexts at play in that specific instance. It promotes a more thoughtful, precise, and evidence-based approach to social critique, moving past simplistic labels like Karen or even defenses against it to understand the specific harms, intentions, and power relationships actually present in the situation. It's really about being rigorous and thoughtful in your own thinking, rather than just accepting or rejecting the shorthand.
So, as we've clearly seen throughout this deep dive, the term Karen is not just some passing internet trend. It's truly a nexus, a crossroads, of deeply ingrained societal issues concerning race, gender, class, and the exercise of power. It seems to be born from very real, often justified frustrations, particularly in the context of racial injustice, but it has undeniably evolved into a highly contested label with clear potential for broad misogynistic application. And this whole phenomenon raises profound questions about who gets to speak in our society, whose anger is seen as legitimate, and how different voices are perceived, policed, and dismissed in our modern world.
Yeah, we've navigated its multifaceted origins, from Mean Girls to Reddit to Miss Anne. We've tried to understand its potent racial undertones rooted in centuries of weaponized white womanhood, and we've grappled with those powerful arguments that it's become a tool for silencing women more broadly. We also explored the complex interplay of intersectional feminisms, where the critique of essentialism constantly challenges us to look beyond simplistic categorizations and to always ask what difference makes in any given situation.
So here's a final thought to leave you with. In an age where digital shorthand, like Karen, can so quickly define complex social dynamics and can even be weaponized in political or personal disputes, how can we, as informed individuals, ensure that the language we use actually challenges, rather than accidentally reinforces, the very prejudices and power imbalances we might be aiming to dismantle?
That's the challenge.
What role does critical thinking play, not just in consuming media and memes, but in thoughtfully contributing to a more equitable, a more effective, and certainly a more nuanced public discourse? Something to mull on until our next deep dive.